Well, good morning, everyone. It is just past 8:30 a.m., which means it is time to begin our fall panel event. First of all, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of our speakers and attendees. My name is Lauren Pratt. I am a 3L at Belmont University College of Law, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Health Law Journal. I'd like to thank everyone for being here with us this morning. We have a great event ahead of us. I want to give a brief overview of the morning and address a few housekeeping items. So we'll begin with our keynote speaker, Dr. Kathryn Edwards, who will provide some essential background information about the development and regulation of vaccines. If time permits, we may have a few minutes for audience questions for Dr. Edwards. And then we will move into our attorney panel comprised of Rebecca Demaree, Clint Hermes, and Brian Dean Abramson, and moderated by our own Dean Debbie Farringer. And they will discuss some of the key legal issues related to vaccines and vaccine mandates from their respective perspectives. And then we will end with a few minutes of Q&A for our attorney panelists. To ask a question for Dr. Edwards or our panelists during the event, please use the Q&A function located on the bottom right-hand corner of the Zoom meeting bar, not the chat function. We will be monitoring the Q&A box throughout the event. And again, welcome to everybody. And with that, I'm going to hand this off to Grace Benetone, our symposium director.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Grace Benetone, and I'm the symposium director for Belmont's Health Law Journal. I am so excited to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Kathryn Edwards. Dr. Edwards is an internationally recognized expert in vaccinology. She was selected to the Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee for the FDA and the Committee on Immunization Practices for the CDC. She is currently a Vanderbilt professor of pediatrics. She received her MD from the University of Iowa and trained at the Children's Memorial Hospital at Northwestern University and Presbyterian St. Luke's Hospital of Rush University in Chicago. And that was before she moved to Nashville and joined Vanderbilt. After Dr. Edwards, our three attorney panelists will participate in a discussion on the law and vaccines. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Edwards.
Well, good morning. I'm really pleased to be here today and to present my work. Can you see my slides?
I don't see them yet, Dr. Edwards.
Okay, wait just a second then. Let me just, so let me, let's see here. Let me share, okay. And here we go. Can you see them now?
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay. Well, first of all, I'm really happy to be here to talk with you about the development, the testing, and the approval of vaccines. I think that we've all become experts with some of the issues that have surrounded the COVID vaccines, but I really want to outline the process. And I want to tell you that this process is a process that has been in place for a number of decades. And even though it has been going a bit faster than usual, it's the same business and the same processes. So I want to tell you a little bit about my perspective. I receive grants from the Centers for Disease Control to look at safety. I'm also funded by the NIH. I consult for some vaccine safety groups, and I serve as independent members where I look at the data from studies that are generated on vaccines that are independent of the companies to actually make sure that we understand their safety and their effectiveness. So what I'm going to do this morning is talk a little bit about how vaccines work, what is their impact on disease, how are the new vaccines evaluated, what is the role of industry, the FDA, and the CDC in implementation, and how do we assess their safety? So we will move quickly. We have obviously in the green a new pathogen, a new infection, and we have no antibody to it or no defenses to it, whereas we have antibody to many other things that we've been vaccinated for or we've seen, as you see here, measles and flu and chickenpox. But this new green agent is something new. So we need to make a vaccine to that. How do we do that? Well, we take parts of that actual organism shown in green, and we use those as vaccines. Those parts are called antigens. And for instance, we know now that the SARS-CoV-2 antigen that we're using as a vaccine is the spike protein, this little green thing that you see here, but you can use many different kinds you can use the whole organism that's killed, you can use a weakened organism, or you can use a part of the organism put into different kinds of delivery systems. But you need to know what you need to make and how you need to make it. Now, vaccines have had an enormous impact on disease burden, and other than clean water, they have probably had the biggest impact on disease burden. Smallpox, diphtheria, measles, mumps, Haemophilus influenza, which is a cause of meningitis. At the end of the 20th century, you see the numbers there. But now some of the diseases have been eliminated, and almost all of those on this slide have been reduced by over 99%. This is some data from the UK just showing that the introduction of vaccine, the impact that diphtheria vaccine and various vaccines have had on disease burden, with a marked decline once the vaccine is introduced. And finally, these are data that came from the CDC last week showing that in blue, the unvaccinated people in terms of hospitalizations for COVID, and those vaccinated shown in green. So I hope I've convinced you that vaccines work. How do we evaluate them? Well, this is a complicated slide, but really is critical, and I want to spend a little time going over it. First of all, we need to know that there is a medical need or a disease burden for the vaccine. If we don't really need to develop a vaccine if the disease doesn't cause an important illness, or it causes it in a very few number of individuals. We need to make sure that it's scientifically feasible, that we can make it, that we can actually generate a product, and that we can study it in animals or preclinical models, generally starting in mice and then going up to even non-human primates, that it can induce an immune response, and then very careful phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials, which I'll explain a little bit more in just a couple slides. In addition, we need to make sure that the manufacturing process is reproducible, it's consistent, that the product when it's made will be the same, not like one product will work and another will not. And all of these things have to be done before a vaccine is licensed, and the FDA is integral in all of these processes. We will come back to this side of the slide in a few minutes. So it's very clear that you need to understand the roles of the different groups. The manufacturers produce the vaccine and they apply for the license. The FDA issues the license based on the study. It may be a final license or an emergency use authorization, which is what we've been seeing with COVID. Then the CDC and their advisory group, called the Advisory Committee on Immunization, issues guidelines for the public sector, which is over half of the vaccine use and all of the COVID vaccine use. And then the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Family Practice, the American Academy of Obstetrics and Gynecology issues guidelines for their constituents. The vaccines are studied in a very careful way. Phase 1 studies generally involve between 20 to 100 volunteers to see, is it safe? Does it seem to work? Phase 2, several hundred volunteers, looks at larger numbers of side effects. Does it cause an immune response? And phase 3 are hundreds or thousands of volunteers. And in general, until COVID, those have been very separate processes, 1, 2, 3. In addition, as I said before, the FDA not only licenses the vaccine because what it does in humans, but also that it can be consistently made. And the FDA has a big role in policing and monitoring the manufacturing sites and the doses. Now, as I said at the beginning, what we're seeing now is very truncated. And so the clinical development, which is shown here in the middle and in boxes, generally was first, second, and third phase trials, as you see at the top. But this is truncated. So phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials are all there. They are present in the numbers, in fact, larger numbers than we ever have, but they are just truncated on a very, very rapid time system. But all the guidelines and all the regulations are the same. Once the vaccine is developed and tested, then the manufacturer submits to the FDA for a licensure, and that licensure is the FDA's responsibility. There is also an advisory committee called the Vaccine and Related Biologic Products Advisory Committee, or VRBPAC, and that has also been very actively and very, very publicly available, and these can be watched real time. This is an advisory committee to the FDA that consists of individuals with expertise. I used to chair that before the current chair, and that is advisory to the FDA. They make suggestions, but ultimately the FDA decides should the vaccine be licensed. Now, one of the very new parts of this process has been general traditional approval, generally must show safety, and there is a final license called a BLA, a biologic license that is issued. But with most of the COVIDs, this has been an emergency use authorization or an accelerated process with assessment of safety and effectiveness, but most of the vaccines other than the Pfizer still are under EUA for COVID, whereas the Pfizer has an actual BLA. Generally, in the absence of an emergency, the regular traditional approval, the BLA, is what one sees. What happens then when the FDA issues a BLA or a emergency use authorization? It then goes to the CDC, and the CDC decides how to use the vaccine, makes recommendations on who should get it and how often should it be given, and exactly the guidelines. That is done also through an advisory committee called the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP. That group is made of experts in various areas. I used to be a member of that committee as well. That is an open public forum that you can watch, and it will be happening on Tuesday and Wednesday of this week, where they will discuss pediatric uses. When the recommendations for the immunization schedule, as I said, are part of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. And as we see here, when making recommendations, the ACIP considers the safety of the vaccine. It considers how well does it work, how serious is the disease, and in children, how many children would get the disease that the vaccine prevents if they didn't have the vaccine. So the benefit and the risk of the vaccine, and that is carefully discussed, and the vaccine then recommendations are voted on by those members. When the ACIP develops those recommendations, then those committee recommendations go to the CDC director, and then he or she, it's a she now, will decide whether they should, she approves them. They are then issued as guidelines and are published in the monthly report of the MMWR. And then the professional organizations, as I mentioned before, will also have guidelines, but they are almost always consistent with one another. Finally, the last red box, the uptake and financing, and that includes the individuals that how the vaccine is delivered, what guidelines are going to be issued. And for most part, many of those guidelines are state derived. So the states get to decide which vaccines can be mandated, which vaccines are needed. And again, you'll hear much more information about how that goes from the subsequent speakers. I do want to talk a little bit about post-licensure or post-EUA. The FDA also has very rigid guidelines for the manufacturers to look at adverse events, to look at how the vaccine works, and those are called phase 4 studies. Those are summarized here. Those are ones that I'm very actively involved in currently. There is the VAERS system, or the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, which is a system which involves actual public reporting adverse events, doctors reporting adverse events. And part of the EUA is that there is a mandate for providers of vaccine to report adverse events. You do not have to establish that they're related. You just have to say that the vaccine was given and something happened, and that is being looked at very, very carefully every single day by both the FDA and the CDC. There is also a large linked database of HMOs that include over 24 million people. These are called the vaccine safety data links, and they look at adverse events after vaccine in a populations where they have all the information in front of them. They have vaccination records, they have hospital records, they have outpatient records, they have medication. So this is a way that one can look at denominator safety. And finally, we lead at Vanderbilt and in a consortium of 7 medical centers, a clinical safety immunization assessment program, or CISA, where every day my day begins with calls, answering calls from doctors about questions about vaccine safety, about what issues that they have, should vaccines be given again, what kind of safety needs to be looked at. And so the safety environment is being very closely monitored on a daily basis. So I hope that my whirlwind discussion this morning has shown a couple things: that pharmaceutical companies produce the vaccine and they apply for the license, that the FDA issues the license for the vaccine manufacturer, but this is a highly scientific, critical, independent assessment by the FDA that includes input from an advisory committee of scientists, vaccine experts, and practitioners that advise the FDA. But ultimately, the vaccine licensure is a decision that the FDA makes. Generally, it's a biologic license, but during COVID, there have been a number of emergency use authorizations. The ACIP through the CDC considers the disease, the vaccine effectiveness, the quality of the evidence, the safety analysis, and the implementation issues and the benefits and the risks and how the vaccine should be used. The ACIP makes vaccine recommendations for the public sector, which is at least half of the vaccine that is distributed. The specialty groups like the American Academy, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, they also provide guidelines. And I would like to leave you with a message that vaccine safety is being meticulously, continuously assessed, and adverse events are reported. And if indeed they are shown to be present in numbers that are significant, that those are included in the warnings and the package inserts and the education for the people receiving the vaccine. So thank you so much. I would be happy to answer any questions if we have a little bit of time, or forego them.
We do have a little bit of time, and actually I have had a couple of questions come through the Q&A box.
Great.
First off, this is a little less related to regulation and more related to, the scientific work you do. But someone asked, do you see mRNA vaccines as the future of vaccine development? And can you address any pros and cons you see to mRNA vaccines? So kind of a big loaded question. But
yes, no, it's a great question. It's an excellent question. And yes, I think that mRNA vaccines have tremendous potential. They can be made very quickly. Once you know the genetic sequence, they can be made, wherever you have the materials to make them. So they could be made in, in developing world sites. They also are highly immunogenic. And for someone who spent a lot of my time in pediatric vaccines, these mRNA vaccines really work well in children. As you know, in the 5 to 11-year-old COVID vaccines, now we're using a third of the dose, and it's just as immunogenic as a full dose. So children respond very, very well. I think that we also are seeing a lot of information about safety, and certainly we will need to put those into the findings as well. But I'm currently on a number of data safety and monitoring boards that are looking at mRNA vaccines for other antigens such as RSV, for CMV. So yes, I think that we are using that, but again, we'll need to make sure that they are immunogenic and they're safe.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Another good question from the Q&A box here. One of our attendees is a nursing home board chair here, and he is asking if you have any suggestions to help convince nurses and bedside techs to take the vaccine. Obviously, there is some misinformation out there. And what advice would you have to convince people that it is safe for them?
So vaccine hesitancy is a big problem. And I think that there are a couple things that are helpful. One is that you have to ask them and listen to what their concerns are, and they aren't all the same. So that's one question, and making sure that the question, and then providing as much information as you can. There are a number of certainly good educational sites. Also that people often believe people that look like them. So, maybe listening to a old gray-headed woman may not be as appealing to some people as a younger, person who may be more akin to your age or your ethnicity or your gender. So trying to get a messenger that is a good messenger that has the knowledge, but also that maybe is more credible for them was important. I think showing information, I just, the data on the impact of the vaccine in terms of hospitalization is amazing. So I think just talking that, but don't be condescending. And the other thing that I think is part of a healthcare message, which I think is really important, is that as healthcare providers, not only do we deliver care, but we can't deliver infections. We are responsible. So if we infect our patients, that is really bad. So I think that we as healthcare providers have an enormous responsibility to deliver care, but not to deliver contagion. And so healthcare workers should be vaccinated. And so those would be suggestions. But again, I think that there's so much politicization and polarity in all of this is just kind of sad.
Mm-hmm. Kind of going off of that last question, there was another question in the chat also about for whom might vaccines not be recommended? Obviously, I guess I can just take that. So
I think one of the things about the mRNA vaccines is that they are not live, so they can't infect you. And so, so there's really not a danger for individuals to receive the vaccine. Even immunocompromised people, they can receive the vaccine. There isn't a problem with that. Which people should not receive the vaccine? Well, we need to be very careful in assessing what happens when people have adverse events after vaccine. So that's a lot of what I spend my time on, is deciding who could get, if they had an adverse event, what does that mean? Will it recur? What should they get? You know, there are a couple different kinds of vaccines. Should we give one as opposed to the other? But overall, there are no individuals that should not be vaccinated at the beginning, because there's nothing that is inherently, unless they have a history of being allergic or to the components of the vaccine. But that's also been quite interesting, that even people that have histories of allergies, or even people who've had allergies, significant allergies to the first dose of vaccine, when they've been administered in very careful settings with allergists, they often haven't had reactions to the second. So everyone should get the vaccine that is that in the EUA is issued. And I also feel that by showing that we believe in the vaccine, I have 5 grandkids between the ages of 5 and 11, and they are going to be the first people on the line to get their pediatric vaccine. So, putting your money where your mouth is, showing that you believe in these things are also very important as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edwards. It has been lovely to see you again here. I think at this point, we're going to move on over to our attorney panel. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Edwards, for being here. Grace, I'm going to hand this over to you. Grace, you're muted.
I knew that was going to happen at some point today to somebody, and it was me. So again, thank you, Dr. Edwards, for laying the groundwork and foundation for us to transition into our attorney panel. So we have our attorney panel. It's comprised of Clint Hermes, Rebecca Demaree, and Brian Dean Abramson. Rebecca is a partner at Cornelius and Collins and specializes in healthcare law and human resources. Clint is at Bassberry & Sims and formerly served as the CLO at St. Jude and was general counsel of Sidra Medicine. Brian is the primary author of the leading vaccine law treatise, Vaccine, Vaccinations, and Immunization. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our very own Dean Debbie Farringer to moderate the panel.
All right, thanks, Grace, and welcome to everybody. I'm really excited to get started with our panel today. Grace, you want to go ahead and turn off our, and we'll just turn into grid mode here so we can see everyone's faces. So we've got a bunch of different types of specialists here today in terms of practice areas and what they bring. And I think I'm going to start off with some general questions just to get an idea of the 3 areas for all of our panelists and let you talk a little bit about what you're seeing and what's going on sort of in your day-to-day practice lives as a result of COVID-19 and a result of vaccines and vaccine mandates and some of the things going on. So just to start out, what are the sort of biggest changes in the legal landscape or your day-to-day practice or your job generally that you've seen since the introduction of COVID-19 and the COVID-19 vaccine? So I guess I'll start with Brian. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your practice and how you feel like things have shifted since either February of 2020 or perhaps January or December of 2020?
Well, I'll tell you, I actually published my treatise, Vaccine, Vaccination, Immunization Law, in 2018. And at the time, it was kind of a struggle to find a publisher who was willing to publish a book on the topic because it was considered very niche. No one's interested in vaccine law. There's no room for development. There were the sort of things that I was told. So it turned out to be very fortuitous that I was able to have someone publish it at that time. That was even before the measles epidemic of 2019, which is now all but forgotten. In a way, everything has changed, and in a way, nothing has changed. And by that, I mean that there are a lot of old precedents that have sat around kind of unused for decades and decades with respect to vaccination mandates, which is the big topic of discussion right now. Is how are we able to mandate these vaccines, at what level, what kinds of exemptions are required. And there are cases going back more than a century, which have recently been in the news now, that are just kind of coming back to the fore and being rediscovered. And it's being rediscovered that there was a period in our nation's history where a lot of large companies and concerns had as a routine practice vaccination mandates for their employees if they were in manufacturing or transportation or some kind of canning or industry like that. In the 20s and 30s and 40s, you had to have a smallpox vaccination. And there was case law saying, well, that's an established thing. You know, you're able to do that. Employers are able to do that. Municipalities and states are able to do that. Really the biggest thing that has occurred, and it's the thing that has just occurred, is we have the first ever substantial effort at a federal vaccination mandate. And the reason that we have this going on now is because this is the first time in the history of the country where we've had an epidemic where states have not individually and on their own sort of effort stepped up and taken all the steps that were necessary to get through and eliminate the pandemic. Of course, we also have a circumstance that is very novel in that we have had a vaccine developed in response to this pandemic faster than any vaccine has ever been developed before. There are some people, of course, in the community who have vaccine hesitancy premised primarily on the fact that this was such a quick development of a vaccine. Although those of us who follow the process very closely understand that first of all, the mRNA technology, which enabled a very quick turnaround, has been itself in development for some 40 years and is not at all a new technology. It's just this is the first major successful application of it in the development of a vaccine. And even with respect to coronavirus vaccines in particular, those have been a subject of study for decades, and in particular, serious study since the SARS outbreak of, I think, 2005. So this really was a confluence of two long-standing trends of study of, can we come up with a coronavirus vaccine, and can we use mRNA technology to develop vaccines very quickly? And both of these have been going on for a very long time. And of course, it was also possible to develop some conventional coronavirus vaccines. The Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca vaccines are what are called viral vector vaccines, where they take adenovirus, which is another virus which tends to infect people, but not in a deadly way. And they graft a piece of the COVID-19 virus onto that, so that that is the delivery system by which the piece of the COVID-19 virus that you want your body to respond to is able to be delivered to the body without all of the danger of COVID-19. And I also want to mention, I was in a seminar last year where someone pointed out that there are over 8,000 species of coronavirus in the Coronaviridae family that have been identified in the wild that are never known to have crossed over to the human population. And any one of these could be the next COVID-19. So we need to be prepared, obviously, for that sort of eventuality. And the other big change that I have seen recently in vaccine law is really the political polarization of responses to vaccination. There has been an anti-vaccination movement in existence since the invention of vaccines in the 1790s. So almost immediately after that, technology was invented. There were people in the scientific community who lauded it and thought it was one of the great achievements in human history, and it certainly was. But there were also people who thought that vaccination was somehow an attempt to thwart God's will, because diseases, and smallpox in particular, that would come across the land and kill large numbers of people, represented a divine judgment of some kind, or that because the early vaccines were cultured in animals and in cattle, they used a variation of the cowpox virus to protect against smallpox, that this was somehow unnatural and therefore forbidden. And from that initial experience, a lot of kind of tropes emerged about vaccines and about their effects and their potential dangers that have just really been passed down from generation to generation, so that we still have them today, even where vaccines have become much safer than they've ever been historically. And the political polarization of this is just a very recent phenomenon. It preys on the tendency of social media to be usable as a venue to spread misinformation and to target it at particular communities. And I think we've seen that done to a very strong degree. And that is something that has changed the atmosphere of how these things are discussed, and is really the reason why we have a situation where some states have been very aggressive in promoting vaccination mandates, and some states have been very aggressive in trying to block vaccination mandates. And that's something we've never seen before in the history of the country, where you have some states saying, okay, we're going to prevent you from mandating this vaccine, prevent even private businesses from determining with respect to their own employees whether they have to be vaccinated to continue working at that place of employment. So it's a very interesting time. And the virus itself is not the reason why things are so novel. There are circumstances that are completely separate from that have made for a very different political and legal atmosphere than we've had before.
Thanks. That's probably a great segue to you, Rebecca, because I think you're sort of our local guru here. And to Brian's point, I just read an article this morning about everything that the Tennessee legislature did yesterday, or at least that they're attempting to do. So could you tell us maybe a little bit about what you're seeing on the labor and employment side? You're coming from a labor and employment perspective, dealing with private clients, private businesses, trying to deal with all this. Talk to us about what you're seeing.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, the Tennessee legislature has been very busy during the special session this week. And in fact, it's my understanding that they are trying to end it by the end of today. And last count, there were about 78 filed bills between the House and the Senate. So this is going to be a marathon day for all of us to watch. Yes, in the private sector, what we've had is a lot of confusion. And to Brian's point, a lot of confusion because the state of Tennessee is taking, can I say, diametrically opposed position to that the Biden administration has taken. So we are one of those battleground states where you've got the federal mandates and many of our employers who get federal funds or who are federal healthcare employers, or certainly the emergency temporary standards that have come down for healthcare and that were already in place for our long-term care partners because of certainly the elderly population. And to Dr. Edwards' point, we are tasked with not spreading contagion. And we have a lot of fights on those fronts. For example, the Tennessee legislature in their last session passed a law saying that the governmental employers could not mandate vaccines or masks. And so you've got that, and then you've got the new vaccine protocols. You've got the emergency temporary standards, which for the Biden vaccine mandate should be out next week is what we're understanding. And then you have employers from 5 employers to multinational corporations, all trying to navigate the same waters. What do we do? Do we mandate vaccines? Are we in a position to tell our employees, we need you to be vaccinated in order to work here, in order to get us back to work for some employers? And then that coupled with what we're seeing on the employment front, that people are leaving their jobs, and we're having, especially in healthcare and in hospitality, which in this case are 2 industries that are sort of lockstepped, having difficulty staffing up. And so, that's generally what I'm seeing right now. But by the end of this week, I think we're going to have a whole flurry of questions and legal challenges to what the Tennessee legislature may or may not end up passing. You're on mute.
Thanks. That's great. Thank you. So Clint, you're a little bit different than just sort of straight up vaccines in terms of regulation of them after the fact. You're dealing with them a little bit more on the front end and the licensure of vaccines through the FDA process. And I understand a lot of different companies out there that are developing various vaccines other than the big ones that we've heard about. So talk to us a little bit about what your clients are dealing with and what sort of new legal issues are coming up in your practice.
Yeah, that's right. So a lot of my practice really for the last, more than 2 decades is focused on, the regulation of clinical research all the way up to the point of product approval. And, starting about 15 years ago, I ended up just sort of by chance getting to work on lots of projects where I was setting up clinical trials for vaccines, both in the US and abroad. And so obviously in 2020, a lot of my time was spent working with, vaccine manufacturers, with, research institutions, and with a couple of large kind of international foundations on the race to a vaccine. And then obviously that transitioned a little bit in December of last year and in January, February of this year to distribution and reimbursement and administration issues. Now I think there is a component of, even helping sophisticated providers understand what Dr. Edwards actually explained really efficiently. So what does VRPAC and what does FDA do, and what does ACIP do, and what does CDC do, and what's the state of play with booster shots? Because we're not used to with any other vaccine following this on sort of a blow by blow basis, where you sort of get a news notification every single time there's a VRPAC vote. I don't think that's ever happened before. And so now it really is a lot about helping providers understand kind of what the state of play is. There is still lots of vaccine research taking place, both in the U.S. and abroad. So, there are additional sort of vaccines that were always supposed to be sort of in the first wave. There are pan coronavirus vaccines underway, nasal vaccines underway. There's lots of other technologies for sort of a second wave. Obviously, research on mix and match and boosters. And also just attempts to vaccinate the world. I do some international health work, and so that's something that I've been working on for about a year. But I think people are really starting to grasp the importance of global vaccination campaigns. Setting aside the moral case for global vaccination campaigns in other countries, in and of itself, there is really a public health case for that in the United States, as we keep seeing additional variants.
All right, thanks. Clint, let's stick with you for a second. I have a general question for all of you, but I think you can answer it from your own lens. What about the distinction between the authorizations for some of the various vaccines? So we've got Pfizer that's been fully approved. We've got others that are still under an emergency or fully licensed. We've got others that are under an emergency use authorization. So from each of your perspectives, how does that change the legal landscape or the legal consequences of that variation in terms of if there's any distinctions for application of the law for those vaccines?
Do you want me to start with that one? Yeah, so I Rebecca and Brian will have much more intelligent thoughts to say about sort of, how that impacts mandates and things like that. What I would just say briefly is that the legal standard for a product to be authorized pursuant to an emergency use authorization is quite a bit lower than the standard for the approval or licensure of a drug or biologic, right? So the approval or licensure standard is it's safe and effective, and the FDA has standards by which safety and effectiveness are demonstrated. The sort of the evidentiary standard for an authorization is that it is reasonable to believe that the product may be effective and the benefits outweigh the risks. And I think that we have seen for some COVID therapeutics, like hydroxychloroquine probably comes to mind for some people, that can be a fairly low bar. What I would say, though, is that for vaccines, the Food and Drug Administration put out guidance documents establishing what they would require for an EUA for a vaccine, and it looked an awful lot like what they require to license a vaccine. So the FDA, on its own, set the bar for an EUA for a vaccine quite high. They might have there were some what they call CMC data, so plant inspection data that they were going to get after an EUA. There were certain things that they were going to do that had a very low likelihood of impacting the kind of the long-term assessment of these vaccines. So I think from an approval standpoint, the way the FDA implemented it is really not all that different from the way they would implement just a regular vaccine licensure.
Okay, thanks. Rebecca, what about you? From a labor and employment perspective, how does that change the analysis or the advice you're giving your clients about vaccines or vaccine mandates or anything like that?
Yeah, so it doesn't change it for an employer very much because we don't get into the medicine. What we do is follow the regulatory guidance. And so once the CDC recommends vaccine, once OSHA recommends certain things for the safety of the particular workforces, then we go with that. The one thing I would mention where it has somewhat impacted vaccine mandates with regard to healthcare is there is at least one pending case in Tennessee, and I'm assuming that this is part of a larger strategy from anti-vaccine groups in Tennessee challenging a mandated vaccine by a healthcare system on the basis that the vaccine, all parts of that vaccine were not fully licensed, and therefore it is human testing without consent. One thing that I would say, and this is purely for my context, which is employment, is that, except for perhaps certain governmental military employers, you are always free to leave your job. And so there is less of an onerous burden on a vaccine mandate when you can indeed argue that, no, this is a requirement. This is a job requirement for this job. This is not the government telling you you must be vaccinated.
Thanks. Brian, I saw you nod over there when Rebecca was talking about some of the cases. Have you seen things like this in the past? And is there, from a sort of case history or case law perspective, what might be the distinction between these two designations?
There's kind of an interesting history behind emergency use authorization itself. That as a process has only existed since about 2005. It was enacted in response to, many people have forgotten this probably, but shortly after the September 11th attacks, there was an anthrax scare where there was a fellow who was driving around the country putting anthrax in mailboxes, literally, not mailing it, but actually driving from place to place and doing that. And this spurred a desire to have a system in place to allow unlicensed medical products to be put into use to respond specifically to an emergency. It was, in fact, used in 2005 to allow use of a then unlicensed anthrax vaccine to be distributed to certain populations. And at the time that it was enacted, it was kind of envisioned that, well, an epidemic or a pandemic would come along, a vaccine would be developed, and we would have emergency use authorization before full licensure. Since then, every epidemic that has happened, the SARS, the H1N1 flu in 2011, 2012, there haven't been vaccines that have been developed quickly enough to actually apply an EUA to those vaccines before the health crisis itself had passed. So the COVID-19 vaccines are the first vaccines since the anthrax vaccine, which had actually already been developed before the law was passed, to be granted an emergency use authorization. And as Clint Hermes indicated, the FDA used what they call an EUA plus standard, a much enhanced standard far above what is required to issue emergency use authorization. This has been litigated at this point. There have been employers who have mandated vaccination of their employees, or schools have mandated vaccination of their students. And the courts that have addressed the situation have universally held that it is permissible for an entity to mandate vaccination using emergency use authorization, authorized vaccine. These courts have examined in particular the fact that the FDA engaged in this EUA plus strategy and had very good evidence from a large number of clinical trial participants showing both the safety and the effectiveness of the vaccine. And this was decided in Bridges v. Houston Methodist Hospital, which was a case out of the Southern District of Texas, and Clausen v. Indiana University in the Northern District of Indiana. It is kind of an interesting footnote that the judges in both of those cases were Republican appointees. One was a Reagan appointee and the other was a Trump appointee. And these decisions have been upheld by the courts of appeals already. And in fact, in the Indiana case, that was brought to the US Supreme Court, an emergency motion for a stay of that mandate. And Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who has authority over the Seventh Circuit for making those calls, denied the stay. So, I think there are a lot of people who think that somehow the Supreme Court at some point is going to step in and save them from vaccination mandates. And that's not going to happen. The Supreme Court has now had 3 opportunities coming from different circuits to issue stays to some very aggressive vaccination mandates, and they have declined to do so. And that indicates that there aren't even 4 justices on the court who are interested in issuing a stay, because usually a justice over a particular circuit will do that if there are enough justices who would be interested in kind of reviewing that at that level. So that is certainly the case with EUA vaccines. The issue of it being an experimental vaccine, there are a lot of people in the kind of anti-vaccine movement or the vaccine hesitant movement who are bringing up the Nuremberg Code. That has also been addressed in several cases. That was also addressed in Houston Methodist. It has been addressed in a District of Oregon case. And that has also been held by the courts to be clearly inapplicable to the situation. As Dr. Demaree pointed out, you're free to leave your job. The Nuremberg Code was really applied to people who are in concentration camps and were actually forcibly being experimented on and didn't have any opportunity to kind of walk away from that in any capacity. So, it's not something that's applicable here. And really, we're kind of in the opposite situation. We have pharmaceutical products in these vaccines that have gone through in a relatively short period, but still in that time, very rigorous testing that does meet all of the qualifications of the Nuremberg Code, with participants in those clinical trials who consented and had the ability to withdraw at any time, and with third-party governing bodies observing those clinical trials that had the power to shut them down at any time. And the vaccines passed muster with the FDA, which is a body that does a really good job of monitoring pharmaceutical development and has not hesitated at all historically to shut down the development of pharmaceutical products, to shut down clinical trials where there were problems. There's one of the kind of saws out there is the FDA is somehow working for the big pharmaceutical companies. But if you watch enough TV, you see commercials where people say, well, the FDA says we have to make this corrective advertisement about our product, and they don't want to be doing that. So there are certainly teeth to what the FDA does, and we have vaccines out here that have passed a very reasonable muster in terms of being able to be used, and the courts have acknowledged that.
All right, thanks very much. I want to move to a second. I'm sure a lot of practitioners out there on our on the webinar here are dealing with the new OSHA regulations that are about to come out, and potential for religious exemptions playing into vaccine requirements or vaccine mandates. So Rebecca, I'd love to talk to you for a second about what you're dealing with. What are your issues for clients? How do they deal with religious accommodations? What are the things that they need to think about when OSHA regulations come into effect, or if they've already thought about or are implementing vaccine mandates? What's some advice you have for your clients generally in this area?
Well, this is timely because just this week, the EEOC issued a new technical guidance rule on how to deal with religious accommodations in employment, which I would refer you to. The technical guidance is used for the investigators in EEOC when they get a complaint of religious discrimination. And that's what this would be. A failure to accommodate religion would be a religious discrimination charge. But by and large, it hasn't, although it's being brought up more, the analysis really hasn't changed from what a religious accommodation request has been in the past for things such as employers who wanted people to shave beards or not show visible tattoos when that had something to do with your religion. What I tell clients and what I think is borne out by the new EEOC guidance is that we don't really want to get into whether or not someone has a sincerely held religious belief. The EEOC interprets that broadly, and in my mind, that's not an area employers necessarily want to investigate. Now, that said, that is not the end of your inquiry. And I think a lot of employees have, based upon some calls I've gotten, are under the impression that I just need a magic letter from my religious advisor or some such saying I have a religious objection to the vaccine and that's the end of it. I don't have to be vaccinated. And that's far from the end of it. Then the employer goes through an analysis saying, we have made a determination that someone in your position, and it doesn't have to be across the board for the employer, but it's someone in that employee's position, we are requiring the vaccination as a job requirement, whether for it being an OSHA for the safety of others, or because you're going to come in contact with the general public, or for whatever reason. And then the employer just goes through an undue burden analysis saying, can I accommodate this stated religious objection of this particular employee? And, you know, if it's a position where they don't come in contact with a lot of people on a daily basis, or can be isolated, or can telecommute for a period of time, then perhaps you would. But I think in healthcare, I would have a lot of difficulty saying a frontline health worker, a religious accommodation could be made, because at this point, I think there are enough, there's enough regulatory authority out there saying that those individuals need to be vaccinated. And it's sort of the same, but a less burdensome analysis than if there's a medical reason, which are the two main accommodation reasons for a vaccine, which would be, I cannot do it because of a medical reason. I cannot do it because I am religiously opposed.
Thanks. It sounds like you're about to get really busy next week as the regulations come out. I did have one question from the audience. We have just about 2 minutes. I think this is a question from somebody who is dealing, this is kind of on the employer side a little bit, Rebecca, or others. What steps should healthcare employers take to protect medical and nursing staff against individuals that come into their facility who are vaccine hesitant or perhaps more aggressively anti-vaccine? Are there tactics that you're seeing that may be effective? This particular person said, other than having security officers posted outside patient rooms or other things, are you experiencing this with any of your clients, sort of road rage in the hospital setting?
Well, 100%. And there are a lot of statistics out there that frontline workers have been aggressed on more in the last 18 months than they have previously. And it's a fairly hostile environment at the best of times, depending on where you're working. I would point you, because, you know, each situation is different depending on how your facility presents itself. I would point you to OSHA guidance and also the American Hospital Association. Both have guidance on their websites on violence in the workplace. And that's really what you're talking about. I gave a seminar to the Bar Association Health Law Forum, and the first thing they wanted to hear about and that we presented was violence in the workplace to healthcare workers. And it's a very a hot topic right now, especially for staffing with nurses. You mean you're losing healthcare staff because of the level of violence, both in the general public, the patients' families, the patients, and your fellow workers. And, all I can say is there is that guidance out there. It's a case by case analysis, but you can certainly look for help to keep your people safe and go to those resources is what I would recommend.
All right. I'm so sorry that we are all out of time. Thank you so much, Brian, Clint, and Rebecca. It's been wonderful. Thanks to all of our panelists for a wonderful conversation.
Hi again. Yeah, thank you to everyone. I'm really glad we were able to get attorneys from different backgrounds to talk about the different aspects of vaccine law. I just wanted to remind everyone that this is a free CLE event for Tennessee licensed attorneys, but we are accepting donations for CLE credit just to help fund the event. So if you do feel compelled to donate, I believe Lauren or Alicia was going to throw the link in the chat. And with that, I think Lauren has a few closing remarks before we wrap it up.
Yeah, thank you, Grace. So I just wanted to say again, thank you so much to all of our speakers, our panelists, and Dean Farringer for helping to moderate this event and also supporting us, during this event. I hope that, and finally, thank you to all of our attendees. Also, I hope everybody has enjoyed the discussions today as much as we have. A few announcements. Please be sure to follow Belmont Health Law Journal on social media. We publish blog posts weekly about current events in the health law space, and we push these blogs primarily through our social media channels. It's also a great way to stay up to date on our upcoming events, which leads nicely into my next point that our spring symposium event is tentatively scheduled for February 18th, 2022. At present, we are planning to host an in-person event, so please mark your calendars. And again, follow us on social media to stay up to date with any and all changes to the event. Regarding CLE credit, there was one question about this. For attending this event, you will receive 1 hour of CLE credit. When you registered, you should have entered your Tennessee bar number, and we will use that to process your CLE credit. Expect to see this reflected within the month at the latest. If you do not see this credit reflected by November 29th, or if you did not enter your Tennessee bar number when you registered, please reach out to Grace at the email address listed on the screen, and we will try to get you sorted out. Again, thank you to everybody for being here today. I'm sorry we went over a little bit on time, but again, follow us on social media, and thanks everybody.